You're watching City Channel 4, your window to our community.
Welcome, everybody, on this sort of rainy afternoon. This is the final Obermann conversation of the year. And I'm just curious how many people have never been in this house before. Oh, wow, that's exciting. Okay, so the Obermann Center is a center that supports faculty research on the University of Iowa campus. And we are particularly a space that encourages collaborative and interdisciplinary work, as well as work that has a public engagement component. And I think all of that is part of what you're going to hear today. The Obermann Conversation series particularly is intended to place University of Iowa faculty members with an Obermann Center affiliation in conversation with a member from the community or somebody else who has a public engagement involvement. So today we're going to be hearing from Glenn Penny, who is one of 3 co-directors of next fall's Obermann Center International Program Humanities Symposium. Now it's, help me out, Glenn, on the title. German Iowa and the Global Midwest. I'm sorry, I had a little brain freeze there. So that'll be occurring October 6th and 7th on campus. And there's quite a few other events that will be happening directly around that time, and actually even over an entire two-plus year period. And so I'm going to allow Glenn to tell you a little bit more about those events and some of the mission behind why the co-directors are planning these and their sense of importance of this topic. Some of what they, I think, hope to do with those events is to highlight the way that German immigrants have affected the history of the state and the culture, and to really allow local communities from all over the state, including high school teachers, local historians, librarians, to be part of that conversation and part of that work of telling that story. And so also with us today is Marlin Ingalls from the Office of the State Archaeologist, and he is somebody who's out there kind of boots on the ground doing that work with communities around the state, so he'll be part of this conversation today. I'll just mention that next fall, our first Obermann conversation is going to be probably at the main library in conjunction with the Shakespeare Folio visiting in the fall, and so we look forward to hopefully seeing some of you then. But for today, let's let Glenn and Marlin begin by telling us more about this project.
Okay, thanks very much. You can all hear me okay, right? Okay. So the thing about the project is that it came out of an experience that a number of us have had thinking about teaching history at the University of Iowa, particularly people like myself who I teach German history, or I used to. And one of the big questions I had was, how can you really interest American undergraduate students in something like German history? How can you allow them to do research? Because usually the kind of research I do requires getting on a plane, flying to Europe or someplace else. And after a conversation with Linda Kerber, she told me that she'd seen German language materials in the State Historical Society in the archive. And so I walked over and talked to Mary Bennett and said, well, do you have anything? And I thought there might be some journals, some newspapers, a little bit of this or that. What she had completely blew me away. What she had was a huge percentage of the history of Iowa written in German, in letters and documents of all kinds, and books, and histories associations, and many other things. I was completely flabbergasted. So I started off by putting together a small course. It was a freshman seminar with just about a dozen students, called Oktoberfest in the Midwest. In order to get them to come, I had to pander to them. And they showed up, and what I experienced among the students was the same thing that basically had happened to me. Initially, when I started talking to them about German history in Iowa, Germans in Iowa, it was very abstract, and they weren't that excited about it. And then we went to the State Historical Society, and Mary introduced us to the materials. And I distinctly remember one of the students starting to space out a little bit as she was talking again abstractly about all the things in the holdings. And then she looked at him and said, "What's your name?" And he told her his name, and she pulled off a census. And she opened it up. She found his grandfather. She showed the line to him, and he took a picture on his iPhone and immediately sent it to his mom. What happened was this one particular student realized that his life, his family, was part of Iowa history, and that Iowa history was part of a very global history that went many places. And one way to interrogate those interconnections is to follow the Germans. The reason we chose to follow the Germans with this bigger project is they're one of the biggest, earliest groups of immigrants that come and settle in Iowa, and as a result, they play a huge role in creating the built landscape, the fields, the farms, the houses, the roads, everything around you. What we're trying to do is not so much list all those accomplishments or write an ethnic history, but rather use the Germans as a window into the transformation of the landscape and the creation of the history, and then to get students to do the history. So that's why the verb isn't write or talk about or think about German history or Germans in the Midwest, but it's actually doing global history locally. So the way it works is that over the last couple of years, we've had more than a half dozen faculty, kind of lost track of all the people who've done it, pull students into their classes and integrate, either in small ways or very large ways, complete ways, students going to the archives, doing the history of Iowa, pursuing Germans in many different ways. So I have a class this semester that's just called German Iowa and the Global Midwest, which I have about 25 students just doing that. They're going out looking at plat maps, figuring out who owned properties, how Germans settled, where they settled, how those properties came together. They're looking at the transformation of cityscapes, the building of churches, the creation of graveyards, of synagogues, of other institutions, and the ways in which these people are interconnected. And they're reading letters in the archives. They're reading maps and mapping districts in places like Davenport and Dubuque and Des Moines. And what they're finding is this tremendous, deep, rich history that's never just about Iowa. It's always connecting. I mean, Davenport is a place that's filled with people who are escaping politics in Europe, and they come to the United States and they land there. And it becomes this incredibly progressive city that's against slavery, for James Brown, and teaching students bilingually for decades in their schools until the First World War comes out. And they're also digging into the documents about the First World War, where you have a complete reaction against this ethnicity suddenly, which goes from toggles from being a positive quality, good hardworking Germans that help us build up the state, to suspicious, perhaps seditious people who are speaking foreign languages during a time of international conflict. So they get to read people's mail. They get to see people turning in their neighbors, settling old scores, and learn things about Iowa history that they didn't know. So, for example, Iowa is one of the 5 states that outlaws the production and consumption of alcohol. Long before we get Al Capone and the kind of prohibition we all know about, Iowa's trying to turn off the taps. But there's lots of reactions to it. And some of you, which you know a lot about, right?
I've had some information and research over the years very much on that very question. And it turned out that from a small question and a small lead that I got from someone, and that was sifted through my archaeological kind of approach to the world, and suddenly it all came together. And although I'd been interested in German history for the last 30 years in terms of settlement patterns and migrations and buildings and farms and all the things you just mentioned, but it turned out that this one incident in the beer riots in the 1880s here in town were really a focal point that really told me a lot about the German population that I didn't really appreciate. You read the history books, the county histories, and they're all good Republicans and they're good Lutherans, and they have so many acres and they have these many fine children, and this is where they live and this is who they married, and maybe if they paid extra for it, a picture in the book. But that's the gloss, truly, that there was all kinds of tides and times going on at various points in Iowa City's history, and certainly eastern Iowa. I mean, I would say that especially in the early settlement and up to the 1855, when the railroad stopped here, this was a jumping off point for German population and settlement. The land office was here in Iowa City. So if you wanted to settle around this area, you came here to buy your land. And it appeared at the very beginning, when you're talking about them as a group, as opposed to not just here but across the Midwest to the East Coast, that the other ethnic groups didn't come as well heeled or with money in their pocket as much as the Germans did. They seem to have left for a number of different reasons, but while they left, they managed to put together a good bit of money and came here and were able to move forwards in a way, business-wise and economically, better than a lot of the other early settlers.
Well, I mean, Jennifer asked me to tell you a little bit more about also the program that we've got tied to this bigger topic. Right now, we still have students finishing up classes and doing research, but in the fall, we're going to have two major conferences. One is the Obermann Symposium, where we're bringing in really authorities on American immigration history who've looked at Germans, or some of them are Germans who've been studying American history as well, who are going to take a look at this broader process of Germans. As you said, much of what you said about the Germans settling in Iowa City or coming through Iowa City is true for across the Midwest and the United States in general. But we've got a dozen people coming in who are going to focus on what's particular about Iowa, how that fits in the general settlement patterns in the Midwest, but also more broadly in the United States. And then we have a second conference, which takes people who do German history across the Midwest. The Midwest, the Big Ten, has always been a central area for the study of German history, and ask them, okay, this is what we're doing locally in Iowa City in our archives. This is how we're branching out. How could we do this in Ann Arbor? Or how could we do this? How would you do it in Michigan State? How would you do it in Wisconsin? How would you do it in these other places across the Midwest? How can we tie it together? So that's going to be a bigger conversation there as well. And hand in hand with that are a whole series of other projects, one of which is the museum exhibit, which is going to be in the Keys Gallery in the Old Capitol. It's going to open up basically in September. It'll be a soft opening a bit earlier. And that's all based on this undergraduate research that we're talking about. And that's the other thing we want to talk to the historians about that we're bringing in, is how to get those students active and actually doing history, right? Not just reading what we write about, but actually producing it, manifesting it, and then disseminating it. Because our hope is that the project doesn't just allow us to engage, right, with the public, but actually allows the public to enrich their own family history, their local history, what's going on in their counties, in the state, the Midwest in general, the region. And this is, I think, the great payoff of the project, is that if people become involved, we can learn a lot. And it doesn't have to stop with Germans, right? This is just one of many, many groups. And it sets up a pattern of research that should go on as we start to study, well, bilingualism still exists today. Schools, lots of my friends want to move over so that their kids can study Spanish and English simultaneously. Why not? For some of the same reasons that people who weren't native German speakers put their kids in the Davenport schools that's taught them basically German and English simultaneously before the First World War. So there are a lot of parallels that run through the 19th and the 20th century. The thing about that I found really interesting about the beer riots in Iowa City is the degree to which it's not just about drinking. Yeah, it's about economy.
Yes, and politics.
And politics, yeah. So
Yes.
Did you look into that a bit?
I did. In that, one of the main players was on the city council. And it so happened, as you said earlier, that Iowa had gone through two previous prohibition phases. What most people don't realize is that the river towns pretty much ignored it. And the other inland towns tended to, depending on how they were set up at the time. And Iowa City at that time had a very Christian conservative Methodist kind of approach to this prohibition. And there was various segments in town, the Czechs and the Irish and Poles and Italians and the Germans. But the Germans had the biggest economic effect in terms that they owned and built two of the breweries. And these breweries were beer factories. They were large industries, and they were cutting-edge technology for the time in the mid-1850s or early 1850s, and they employed hundreds and hundreds of people. Now, Iowa City also was divided up in a sense that there was 8 bars allowed in town at any given time. They tried to keep it cut down like that. But from experience I'd had in other river towns, especially Dubuque, the German Catholics and the Irish Catholics and the Czech Catholics did not imbibe much together. And in other ways, the women were very much outcast in the whole drinking proposition. But the conflicts, especially in eastern Iowa and between Iowa City, but mostly in what I read about in Dubuque, led to other riots, earlier riots in the 1850s and 70s. And they had one in Dubuque where in the street that over 30 people died in one night. So the amount of influence they had in Iowa City was enough to put the city in an uproar with the riots that we did have, which was the attempted lynchings and tar and featherings and threatening various justices of the peace and families and lawyers and essentially taking over the whole city. So these animosities, but also I think the economic power that these folks had, as almost we call them the German mafia. They were a bit of a overlord over the entire city because they were and had become incredibly wealthy. Mm-hmm. And they weren't the only ones. The German brewers were by far the largest group that came into eastern Iowa. There was a few French and Belgian brewmasters and operators, and Cedar Rapids had a very large one, and most of the river towns had one or two or more, and they were a very strong political group. They really had the cash to invest in who they wanted to get elected, and they did.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the things I learned from my students, he wrote a paper on breweries in Iowa, particularly in Dubuque. Dubuque had one of the largest breweries in the country at one point, and it also employed a tremendous number of people. And initially, when I was reading about Prohibition, most of what I read about was religion. Some of it was gender, because a lot of the people who were pushing for temperance were women who didn't like the treatment they received from drunken husbands, among other things. And that seemed to be the center of the debate. But the more I read about the economy behind the brewing, where I'd walked by the England Theater for a decade before I never thought it had anything to do with beer and brewing. And suddenly I realized that the whole economy of the city was driven by the production of alcohol. And if you pass a law that outlaws the production of alcohol, you pass a law that puts a lot of the city out of work. But it goes further than that, because I'd also spent a decade driving around through rural areas of Iowa, seeing a lot of corn and soybean and a lot of fields that look kind of monotonous to me, to my sort of outsider's eye. And then when I read about the numbers of breweries, I had to think about, well, what goes into beer? And of course, it's not corn often or soybean. It's other things, many other things. And where did they come from? They came from Iowa. So suddenly it's not just the people working in these factories, which I think is right to call them. It's the people supplying them, the farmers around who are growing these various crops, not for a global market, but for a local market, where the product is being sold locally, it's being purchased and then processed and then distributed all locally. It's a local market. And a lot of farmers lived through a local market that was also ended by state law. That means it's not just that the economies are transformed, but the very landscapes are transformed, right? I mean, from here to Cedar Rapids, the fields would have looked different, a lot different. And it's these kinds of juxtapositions that not just change the landscape, change the economies, but also throw those farmers into a world in which they're producing ever more for a limited global market and are also at the mercies of it, right? So when we study agricultural history, social history, farm crisis, and things like that, there's a long history in the transformation of the landscape. It has a lot to do with things like brewing, which
Absolutely.
I'd never thought about.
Mm-hmm. Oh, all markets here for that, in general, all markets were, but certainly the beer market was very local up until after the Civil War. And then suddenly Iowa becomes national. I've been called from people in Oregon who had found beer bottles from Dubuque. So the breweries there were a staging point for major shipments in the construction of the railroads, and their beer constructed a lot of North America's railroads. The railroad here got in town in 1855, more or less, and at that point, this was boom town, boom land, and everybody was coming in, and they had money in their pockets, or looking for work, or they looking to build a life, and they're looking to buy land, and they're looking to start a business, and the first thing many of them wanted was a city lot. And so the breweries are right in the middle of town. They are right near downtown, and the brewing community and the beer masters' houses are right next to them. And the people that work nearby in this neighborhood right here frequented them, and it would have been a far different city. We don't think about the smell of beer in the air 24 hours a day. We don't think of people chopping wood 24 hours a day. We don't think of the giant horses and the farriers and the teamsters and the coopers and the woodcutters and the people inside the building. And there was just an anthill of activity around here 24/7. I remember as a child driving into Peoria and crested the hill and the breweries and distilleries. There was just like this beer pall that kind of settled there, and you just got used to it. It was part of the air you lived in. It was that close to you, and all the people you knew were there, and all the activities you participated in were related to that. And at one time, over in Upper City Park, where the swimming pool is, there was one of the largest beer halls in this part of Iowa, run by the Germans, and also associated with the Old Settlers Association, the cabins up there, which were just across from it. But the pictures of the people out in front of that beer hall are really interesting. You get all kinds of dress and ages, and you see that all these people are coming together to drink and dance and socialize, because it was a very structured society, I think, at that time amongst people. You mostly knew people from your church or your work, and there wasn't much crossover or anything in between. And so understanding also that the beer here in town was coming out at a time where the water wasn't very good. I mean, food was unhealthful, the water was unsafe. They were coming from a culture where they made all kinds of beers, from little small beers for the children to big beers for the adults and everything in between. And that people developed a taste for a certain kind of beer, and the breweries would produce different beers at different times of the year. When you look at the census records or the industrial census records of what they're producing, you really don't have any idea, because they're just saying, we made 10,000 casks this year. Or we used so many bushels of rye or wheat or barley or sugar or molasses that went into this, but you don't get any kind of an idea of how it was being consumed, nor do you get any other idea of the other things that were being consumed in Iowa City besides alcohol. And certainly German bitters had a large effect during Prohibition times, and Hostetler's bitters, which are almost all alcohol and very expensive, far more expensive than regular beer and alcohol, they were the only thing available. So you see people switching back and forth between patent medicines and pharmacy alcohol. If you had a prescription, you could go to the pharmacy and get some whiskey or some beer or something, but otherwise you couldn't during those Prohibition days. As I say, in the river cities, mostly they just kind of ignored that. But Iowa City was not that way at all. They really decided to take a strong stand on the whole thing. And it really made people very angry. You have to be very angry at a situation to riot, right? And tar and feather people and attempt lynchings and scare the bejesus out of the whole downtown area. And we don't realize that over where Van Allen Hall is now, that was a church park. And that's where most of those riots occurred, and the almost lynchings that got stopped. And it took the local citizenry to come out well armed and drag people out of the crowd by force, firing off their weapons around them and then taking them downtown and hiding them to keep real violence from happening. So there wasn't a great deal of bloodshed, but there was a lot of fear, and that just kind of built on itself over time. And the brewers, who were losing a great deal of money, got sued, and they held on until that prohibition was repealed, and then suddenly, boom, they're just back in business like nothing had ever happened.
It's pretty amazing. Also, the story of the beer caves is fascinating too, because it's lager beer, right, that ends up in the caves. And my understanding is the reason they build the caves, which are, you know them very well, so they're impressive achievements. You have to imagine building these. They're brick, right?
These ones are brick. Yes, mostly brick.
And they're made, 1850s, 60s?
They were early 1850s for the Englert, and then the Union Brewery is the 1855 to 57 for the construction.
And this blows me away. You go down to the Hamburg Inn, right? Which, again, I'd done for a decade. Never thought that I'm walking above caves or beer caves that were created by artisans, stonemasons who are highly skilled, brought to Iowa so they can create these places to store beer at a particular temperature, because that's what lager beer needs, right? And Iowa's the perfect place to do it, it turns out. You couldn't do it in Missouri because it's all a limestone base. You'd have to chip down into the rock. So there's this, I like to talk about the built environment, but we oftentimes forget that the built environment goes underground as well, right? Right? Yeah,
definitely. And the people who built these places were German stonemasons. People who operated and owned them were all German. And the ones here, although the bedrock is different places at different depth, they had to do a cut and cover. They had to dig this immense hole, and then it's got to be 1 million bricks in these things. The German brick makers were producing all these bricks. People were hauling the bricks over, and masons were putting them down. And it took a long time for them to, several years, to construct these caves, of which the longest one's about 113 feet. And so that's a lot of beer, and the beer factory is run on the gravity system, and everything's being cooked and heated and boiled at the top, and then it kind of winds its way down to the 55-degree perfect atmosphere down there. And I was once down there in an interview, and one of the interviewers asked me, well, why would people work down here in the dark and by themselves at night in this cramped space? And I kind of replied, just free beer, okay? It's not a big mystery why people work in a brewery. And again, going back to the how the public dealt with that, just the construction of these buildings alone was bigger than any other building in town, short of Old Capitol. And if they could have bought that and converted it, they probably would have. But as it turned out, the 3 that are downtown, there's only the one left. And the other 2 are parking lots, of which there are large tunnels underneath there. And they do collapse. And between George's and I know the Bluebird restaurant there, they lost an SUV a couple of years ago. We have done remote sensing in the parking lots, and clearly there are deep caves, and they cave in. And many times you're parking in the place where I know at Pagliai's parking lot that he's taken a rake and doesn't hit anything underneath the pavement. So you don't know where you're parking exactly down there. And the drain there between the 2 buildings is actually known as Beer Creek. So in those days, that's where the swill went. And so it was mostly full of beer, except on the rainy times. And I'm sure that it was a rank and rancid mess the other times of the year.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because one of my students, actually, when I did this initial class, didn't discover beer caves. He lives in northeastern Iowa, or he comes from northeastern Iowa. Rather, was digging around trying to figure out what were the Germans in his county doing. It's sort of an assignment I like to give students. And he ran upon an archaeological report about a foundation. Not a beer caves, but of a brewery. And essentially, people were digging around in a field, and they found a foundation. They couldn't figure out what it was until after they dug around in it, they started to find lots and lots of barley. And for this student, it was a revelation because it was the same experience I had. He'd grown up in an area which was all soy and corn. And suddenly he thought, barley? Wow, what else were they doing here? And it's great, right? Because it's a moment in which you see a student have an epiphany. the landscape around me has been recreated by other people. And it wasn't always like this. And it doesn't have to be this way. What was it like? And suddenly, it's an amazing pedagogical moment because you don't have to say, follow that up, go to the library, go get this. Suddenly they come to you with a book and they say, Professor Penny, what is, and what can you do? You're excited. If you're me, you're delighted. And you think, okay, how can I do this with more students? And a lot of the times the built environment's not an old foundation, but it's things that are still there. I mean, you mentioned the dancing that was going up in City Park, which I wish I'd been there to see. But conviviality is part and parcel of these breweries because it's usually not just a brewery. There's also a beer garden. There's a place. And if you go back and look at the old almanacs, the old calendars that have images of these breweries, what you get is not just a picture of the economic productivity, all right, the labor that goes into it or the goods that are coming out of it, but there's always pictures around it, pictures of people doing things. And they're having fun.
They're doing a promenade.
Yeah.
And the one in Dubuque was called Tivoli. And in the summertime, it gets so hot, and people would go into the beer caves because they're full of ice.
Yeah.
All right. And so you could go in there and get beers and sit amongst a bunch of ice cubes and come out at dark and do your promenade, and the candles would be on and bands would be playing, and it was how you met people in a social condition outside of work in the church. But going to the Epiphany, when I got involved with this, I was kind of backdoored into it, but happily to there. But suddenly I realized that I can get all these articles about the beer riots in German, right? And they have I'm sure, a different tact on those things. And so hopefully working with that, I'm going to get more and more about what was going on here from that particular point of view. And as one person said about these things is that it's obvious that if you control the press, you control the politics of the situation. And so not everybody read. A lot of people read Czech or Polish or Italian or English when they weren't reading the German newspapers. And it was a whole different kind of subset of influence that was happening in the German community at large across the state. And oddly enough, through the newspapers, during those particular riots in Iowa City, there were people getting ready to get on trains all the way up in Ames and Marengo and come down here and help riot. Support our brothers.
It's interesting because Glenn Erstein, who's part of the big project on German Iowa and the global Midwest, had a great student who could read the German newspapers and then could go and read the reports in the German newspapers about these beer riots and compare them to the English language reports and determine that they were quite different. Right? And this is the other thing about the language that's so important is that there is, when I said at the beginning that there's this huge percentage of Iowa history that's written in German, I wasn't kidding. I mean, it's quite ironic that the city schools decided to disband the teaching of German in Iowa City. It's not ironic. It's a crying shame, particularly since so much of the history is written in German. And it's a living language. I mean, it's the fourth biggest economy in the world, Germany, right? So it's hardly just a heritage question. But the bigger point is that when we start looking at these different language journals and newspapers, you get completely different perspectives into what we thought the history of things were. For example, what does it mean to have the brewery? And a lot of the discussions you read in the German language sources, it's all about the conviviality, the sociability, the fact that beer is not alcohol, beer is food. Right? Beer is like bread. Anheuser-Busch, who you've probably all heard of, probably had yourself a Budweiser now and then. The old Budweiser advertisements used to say exactly that. Beer is like bread. Beer comes from these grains. It is healthy. It is good for you. And this was put out at first in response to movements by temperance movements, which are national movements, but also very well supported in the state of Iowa. In fact, if you want to read the Christian Women Temperance Union reports from the annual meetings in Iowa, they're all digitized at our library. They're all open. You get them either by going through the digital library or going through the Iowa Women's Archive, which is also a fantastic resource filled with German sources. But there you have the debates between why you should or shouldn't drink alcohol. And the bad thing about the beer is the alcohol. The good thing about the beer is the calories, believe it or not. And if you have to choose where you get your calories, it's not a bad choice.
Well, if you're working hard,
Yeah.
you need calories, and people don't really understand. Also, in the taverns that were available, there was two things. Beer was really expensive, and there were no chairs or tables. All right? And if you drank, you got free food. Usually as much as you could consume. And when you got too far along, then if you couldn't stand up, you had to leave. There was no chairs or tables. That's the way it worked. And Iowa City had their last stand-up bars that were remnants of that old past up until the 1970s or so.
That's
And there was others that they would come up to about here, and there were no restrooms, and the spittoons were everywhere, and it was probably a pretty unsavory place for us nowadays. But to the people there, it was the great Bonami. It was the great gathering place, and the guys in the derbies and the Stetsons and all kinds of people mixing together, usually of the same ethnic group and religion, but I think German Lutherans and German Catholics and others all seem to be together, and I wouldn't doubt but what there was. Of course, intermarriage in a small town, an opportunity to move ahead through marriage or fraternity kind of organizations. And certainly the Germans had some very well organized fraternal organizations like that. The one in Davenport is very well known and on the National Register of Historic Places. It's at the end of the old Rock Island Arsenal Bridge there. But it was on its way going down, and a lot of the smaller, the 1840s and 50s parts of these cities have been taken down already. So what's left is unusual, and Iowa City has gone through urban renewal and other elements like that, but they've managed to try to hang on to a lot of these areas. And so when you go down to around the breweries, the brewmasters' houses are standing there. You can see how they live. There's their house. Their house was right behind their brewery. And when you look at the old plats, there's other dwellings just right next to it and around it, and the grocery stores and the meat markets. And there's also the element that the roads were a mess and full of manure. And when you're outside of one of these breweries and all the comings and goings, and it was a muddy mess, and these giant wagons and the horse manure and all this would have been very troublesome, but that didn't bother people. I guess that was normal in the 19th century and before, whereas they just didn't mind horse manure all over the place, but they couldn't take the thought of somebody having a beer.
So I'm really interested in the built environment and in your office and how much they are able to track and record the transformations of these neighborhoods, as you say, from the 40s and the 50s, because, one of the reasons the beer caves are still there is they're underground, right? So as you say, people built things on top of them and then later discovered them when they collapsed. But there are areas like Davenport where the reports that we have of the cityscapes, the neighborhoods like the Hamburg area, were very German, right? So do you guys keep a lot of records? Do you have of smaller towns and the bigger cities in Iowa, and that'll help us actually reconstruct those environments?
Yes, partly in that what I do as an archaeologist and architectural historian is I am sent out through various, the Department of Transportation or the Corps of Engineers or the DNR, and road construction and dam construction, they impact these communities, where there are small German communities and towns, little nodal communities, or individual farmsteads and things. And we go through the census records and we check who lived there and when, and match those up to the historic maps. And we do, whenever possible, go to the libraries and get personal information. And we also have learned that there were architectural types, more barns and outbuildings, I would say, associated with German farming and settlement that are very recognizable on the cultural landscape. It seems when they tried to build their own houses, they tended to try to fit in with everybody else a little more. It was more of normalizing their existence. But their barns and outbuildings are often very different. And certain historical barn types coming over fairly directly from Germany are more so, used to be all around Iowa City. The four-bay barns and Switzer barns and stone barns, like down in Madison County, and you don't see so many of those here, but they are out in the hinterlands of Iowa. And I was just up in Grundy County, and I was saying I was coming here, and one of the members that I was working with there said proudly that it's all German. Like the entire county is German, and they were very much all German, and they were proud of that. And I guess that was their identity.
Well, I have to tell you another story. When I was teaching 19th century Europe, one of the classes I teach, I was talking about the character of the Holy Roman Empire and the ways in which it was organized around what one historian called a lot of German hometowns, little towns that had very distinct characteristics. And I started to describe these characteristics, and the students in my class, about half of them started to look a little bit uncomfortable. And then one of them raised her hand, and she said, it's just like that where I live. And another said, me too. And then they started to talk about the similarities, but there were also these distinctions between their people and the Bohemians. And I sat there and I went, what do you mean the Bohemians? And then they explained to me that the Bohemians had settled on this part of the town and the Germans on this part of the town, and they knew who each other were. But I could drive through town and all I saw was, the quick stop and the Safeway and the streets that looked like everywhere else. But they saw these landscapes that were quite distinct and ethnic. And when we go and look at further back in the history, one of the people who's coming to the symposium in the fall, Kathleen Konzen, who's used to teach, just retired from the University of Chicago, and probably a foremost historian on German ethnicity in the United States. She wrote an article about phantom landscapes. And what she was talking about is the degree to which Germans could walk through Missouri or Iowa or places like you're talking about and see these barns and know that other Germans lived there.
Just by walking down.
Right.
And they would actually be family gangs of young men and a family, and they would walk down the road, knock on your door, and ask you, do you need a barn? And somebody'd say yes. And there was a group over across the river in Iowa that built German brothers that built 50 barns in one summer, and they put the roof on them and the framing, but they didn't put the siding on. They would come back later. There's a Czechoslovakian log cabin tavern outside of town here, not very far, where a group of German brothers came by, and the Czechs said, well, would you build us a nice cabin? And they did. And they would go do masonry projects. They would do bridges, and they get to know each other. But as they went along, they're leaving trail of German construction behind them. And so you may see an Irish guy with a German barn, but he loves that barn. All right. He paid for that barn. He earned that barn. Horses don't know or care. So...
But the really interesting thing to me is how people can walk through these environments and see different things based on what they know, right? Based on their understanding of something like that, of architecture, and go, oh, that kind of people lived there. These sorts of people lived there. Some of us can do that with churches, right? From a distance, you know what a Lutheran church looks like, or maybe distinguish a Catholic church from another denomination. The churches are amazing too because they seem to last longer than the houses. Am I right about that? Or depending on the location?
Well, certainly the German Catholic churches in Iowa are very large, voluminous, and well built, and it's only now recently that the rural churches are running into a little bit of problem simply because people are dying and others are moving out. But they hang on, and they're wonderfully built buildings. And I would also say about an environment back in the day when they were in the 19th century walking along, they could probably tell from what province of Germany they were from.
Well, that's true too. I mean, that's the other thing we learn about migration history is chain migration tends to be local to local a lot of times. We tend to think, we use this big rubric, this term German, and everybody fits into it. But the Germans see lots of distinctions among themselves, right? It's not just German Bohemian. It's also were you from the north, were they from the south, what's your confession, and many, many other things. Class matters too, right? It never stops mattering. So the other thing I found fascinating when I got into this project and when actually students helped me understand this was that we tend to think of Iowa being a very homogeneous place. The University of Iowa, we talk all the time about increasing diversity. But if you go back to the 19th century, there's lots of diversity. Maybe you wouldn't see it as a 21st century traveler who went there and walked around and said, oh, these people look all the same. But they see those distinctions constantly. And like you said, the different Catholic groups, right? The Irish Catholics and the others don't necessarily drink with each other. They don't do a lot of things with each other, right? They live on different parts of town. They go to different churches. And in Carroll, Iowa, actually, there's a great newspaper article that one of my students dug up in which the Catholic Church gets a new priest. It's sent to them by the diocese. And he shows up and he's Irish, and all the Germans leave. And they build their own church 2 blocks away, a new Catholic church, because there's no way they're going to be preached to by an Irishman. These kinds of things are not limited to Carroll. That populates the landscape. It's amazing. And that's also one of the reasons you get so many churches, right?
Absolutely. And, well, you get, like, the Amana Colonies, an entire pietist community coming out here from the east and from Germany before that. And there are people coming directly over to this 55,000-acre settlement and they have out there. And look at their buildings. That's the way a lot of Iowa looked like right at that time. And we forget. We don't see those. But there are other areas of the state, as I said, in Madison County and a few other places up in Dubuque and around that area where these buildings are still standing out in the country. And if you go down the right rural road, there's a great church, or there's a inn or tavern that has been there, since the 1830s or 40s, and it's all still going on. There's evolution of roads and trails and such things shift north or shift town. Maybe they'll miss your town and hit your town, and it's all out there. Now, what I was trying to do as an archaeologist is, well, how do you prove these people were German or not? And as I said about the houses, they, in many ways, would take on the normal culture around them. Their houses mostly looked like others. There were some that would build very ethnic houses or even mills and things like that. But the more they came, eventually, they would break all their German dishes or their glassware, and things would break, and they would have to go to the store and resupply, and they would have to, and eventually you start losing the way the German, blue transfer print plates with the scenic area in the middle of some place in Prussia, because when people couldn't read, a lot of the dishes were designed for you to have a bit of a tour of a place. And if you were going to a home and you had birds on your dishes, that meant you weren't going to get any alcohol. Or especially herons. That was an especially bad sign. If there was herons on your dishes, like, whoa.
Bad scene. Okay, it's going to just be just water.
Not only were they identifying with each other on the larger, but their tableware also told the stories of how they felt about so many things.
Well, one of the stories we're telling in the bigger project, of course, is a transformation that takes place around the First World War, right? Where, as I said earlier, there's this sort of toggling when German goes from being a big asset to being a big detriment. But we know a lot about that, and if you were to dig into the annals of Iowa, one of the things you would see is that there are articles about the First World War. There's articles about the Committee of National. I always want to call it the Committee of Public Safety, but it's not. There's a set of committees that basically are set up to, look for sedition, look for any overt activities, and most of you probably have heard of the Babel Proclamation and the efforts to outlaw the use of any foreign language, which led to very funny letters being sent to people in charge of rounding up seditious characters, asking questions like, well, will Latin be also outlawed in the churches in Iowa, or is it just German and French? And then there's debates about whether or not it should be French, since after all they're on the Allied side. But some people were confused about that as they were rigorously chasing down either conference calls on telephones or friends that they'd heard in the street, or settling old scores about prohibition and other things. But one of the things that we've learned that's quite important, I think, is that just like the scale of the barns doesn't change necessarily immediately, neither does the use of the language. And while there's a radical transformation from the teaching of German in public schools, right, those Davenport schools that were bilingual stop being that. We go from 25% to a few percent of people learning German in public schools, not just in Iowa, all across the United States. But that doesn't change the way people talk to each other out on the farms. And this is an amazing part of the story.
Well, thinking about the later times, World War II up to the Second World War, Iowa had 7 German prisoner of war camps. And they were very good to these prisoners, and this had an effect on how our prisoners were treated in Germany. And you go to the towns, and a couple of those, like in Mason City or someplace up there, they've been converted to country clubs, and the buildings are still reused, and the people still spoke German. And some of those folks maybe even saw a son or a relative or somebody near and dear to them that were in these internment places. And they weren't just prisoners. They would have parties, and they would cook, and they would go visit and sing during Christmas, and they became a small part of the community for a few years.
Right. One of the people who's participating in the project is a graduate student who's working on the camps in Algona and other places where the people she's focused on produce an orchestra, right? They work with these families. They speak German with them. Some of them come back after the Second World War and settle here. And this is the other thing we always forget is that immigration doesn't stop from Europe during the 20th century. The numbers do go down, but the largest number of foreigners, that means people born in another country, coming into Iowa remains German, actually for decades after the Second World War. And the thing about immigration and language and ethnic patterns and markers is that as long as you have an influx of new people, right, who use those things, then those things continue to be perpetuated over time. When that flow of people from other places stops, then that's when you oftentimes see the complete dying out or eradication. It doesn't always happen that way, but as long as the flow is there, it seems to keep things going. And one of the things we found is that when you get to the interwar period, you have new kinds of people coming to Iowa who claim to be German, right? Some of them are coming because of the tremendous devastation that Germans faced in the wake of the First World War, where over 700,000 people starved to death in the last years. And they're just looking for work, and they follow old migration patterns, and some of them end up here for the same reason other people did. Later, then, when you get the rise of National Socialists and you get political refugees, you get a lot of German Jews fleeing for their lives, and you get places like Scattergood welcoming some of them. You also see them, in some cases, following similar patterns. Now, there's a lot of complexity there, right? Because not all Germans are all the same. Not all German Jews are all the same. People don't leave for the same reasons. Not everybody's welcomed in the same way. But there's also those old patterns are there, and that makes a big difference in the choices people make. So actually understanding what happens in Iowa during the Second World War means understanding the ways in which it builds upon patterns that have been developing over decades and decades since back to the 1850s.
Yes, and even taking it back into the past a bit, the Germans in Iowa during the time of the Civil War in Iowa had probably the largest recruitment and per capita of any state. And the Germans were definitely some of the first to join up. Not that there weren't some German slaveholders and such, but Iowa really sent a lot of vigorous young men who did not come back from that war. And that kind of changed the aspects of how they felt about North and South, East and West, the river towns and the central towns, the Minnesotans up north. And Iowa has its own geographic, cultural history related to where you live and settled next to. And people look at the river towns as being different. Other people up in Grundy County look at Iowa State and go, that's like the tropics. It's always like 10 degrees warmer down there. And people would settle down here quicker because the wheat was a little easier to grow. And, back in the 1850s, the Germans, wheat and barley were one of the largest crops. And then a boll weevil or a rust or some epidemic came in, wiped all that out. And suddenly they're without this crop. And it changed the entire cropping history of the state, where they had brought in all these emmer wheats and other wheats from Germany, and they were doing fine until they didn't know there was a parasite here and wiped them out. So all that just blends together in this wide and varied cultural history that we call Iowa City and the state of Iowa. And, I'm from Illinois, and I've really come to appreciate it a great deal.
Well, these states are interconnected. I once wrote a story of a very odd guy who developed a proto-wetsuit, and to test it, he floated from St. Paul to St. Louis in the river, and behind him was a German journalist in a boat. That's how I found out about that guy. And as they floated down the Mississippi, they were greeted by people living in all these little towns, and they were filled with Germans. So I actually learned this story by reading the German language press from the little towns along the Mississippi between St. Paul and St. Louis, which was, extensive. It was a huge amount of press. And along the way, they stopped, and they never really had to go hunting. They got coffee and cake from the local Germans. They drank beer, either that was produced there or imported in bottles from Koblenz. And they spoke German the whole way. And this was in the 1870s. The other thing is, you can actually see some of this. I mean, one of the places that, if you want to go look at German history in Iowa, go to a graveyard. I was just in Bremer County, which is one of these counties, that's very, very German, and on a lark pulled over at a church, which was a Lutheran church, and walked over to the stones. They're all written in German. And what's amazing is it doesn't stop in 1917 or 1918 or 1919. And in fact, what you see is a hybridization, right? A combination of German lettering with these sort of Grant Wood modernist images of tractors and other Iowan things that have to do with farming. And you can just sit there and look across the landscape of the tombstones and see the transformations, integrations of the culture. It's fantastic.
I'm going to cut in here and see if there's any questions. We have just a few minutes left, but are there questions from the audience?
Thank you for this. I mean, I've been meaning to get in touch with y'all for a while now. I just started in January as a curator at the museum, and one of the things that struck me about arriving in Iowa is how much being aware of the presence of this German presence fundamentally had altered the way I thought about American art. Precisely somebody like Grant Wood, and even the kind of trajectory of, let's say, modernism and avant-garde design and architecture. If you go back to the teens and look at the kind of design journals, what are they citing as the newest and the best out in Europe in German-speaking journals? But the grain silos of the Midwest, right? And if you look at Grant Wood and the iconic couple, the American Gothic. And, it's oftentimes his inspiration is oftentimes described as Northern Renaissance and things like that. But if you, keep in mind that he was in Munich in 1928, what's going on there? It's Neue Sachlichkeit. And what is this moment in, 1930s interwar American modern figuration, but something kind of like a wry, socially aware, tongue-in-cheek kind of figuration that has everything to do with the kind of figuration that's going on in the 1920s in Germany. And so the kind of work that you all are doing, highlighting the kind of like, let's say, cosmopolitanism or internationalism of like Midwestern culture, bleeds in the other way in terms of the kind of dissemination of American culture, technology, and innovation back to Europe. And I guess the question that I have for you all that I would love to learn more about is what we do with the kind of the space of international imagination that's attached to the specifically German language Jewish journals that proliferated in the interwar period, that were present also in the Midwest, but of course had international circulations. I'm wondering if you've come across their impact in your research.
I have it in mind, but I know that there are people working on precisely this kind of thing. I have seen a lot of German artists who come to the Midwest, and this starts really early. From people doing landscapes and painting American Indians in the Missouri River, and creating entire iconographies of the American West that are produced in Dusseldorf, for example, and then find their way onto the walls of the Missouri Capitol or the nation's capital. The German Americans are producing a lot of that art. So that doesn't really stop then when we get into the more modern period in the 20th century, as you said. So I always think of people like Marcus Hartley, who's trying to figure out what it means to be American. So he goes to Berlin, and then he comes back and starts painting scenes of the American West in this new modernist fashion, influencing both Germans and Americans alike. There's a lot of that circulation. Unfortunately, none of the people we had working with students were in art history. Which would have been great. We tried, but we're open. We'd like to bring in more. It'd be fantastic.
Apropos of that, just to mention that 2016 is the centenary year of Iowa City's synagogue, Agudas Achim Synagogue. It had a precursor, which was a German congregation formed toward the end of the 19th and turn of the 20th century, which had their characteristic cultural conflicts as well as their cosmopolitan side. And you can expect an event or two on that theme in the fall, probably at the synagogue.
You didn't say anything about the school system in the 19th century. Were the Germans running their own schools in German?
Yeah, there are a lot of parochial schools and there are private schools as well. In places like Davenport, they're quite extensive, but you can see them out on the landscape too.
Yes, a lot of the small local communities were used German only as their first language, and that continued certainly up until the World War I, cut it way back, and then at World War II, the state national government just cut it off. But up until that point, very much so.
Was it both elementary and high school?
I believe so, yes. And of course, a lot of those would have been related to the churches that the community was around when they started doing the one-room schools in Iowa. After, you get rural free delivery and all that era of good roads, and that it kind of cut back on, I think, the only German speaking schools a little bit.
We can just have one more question. Thank you.
Many German families came to Iowa to avoid military conflict and military obligations in the principalities. What kind of reactions do we see in Iowa from those families when it became apparent after the first year of the Civil War that there were going to be draft registrations and a long war?
It's hard to speak in generalities about what all these various families might have done, but in general, what is striking is though a lot of them are you're right, are moving away from military service. It seems to be their concern of the kind of military service, who they're having to serve. And when you get the Civil War, fighting for the North is something that across the German communities gains an incredible support.
It's a larger cause than I think what was happening in Germany at that time. They were kind of being used as cannon fodder and slave labor, or maybe in the Civil War they were still cannon fodder to some extent. But they felt very free to sign up, and they were proud of that. And when you look at the numbers that were killed and the ones enrolled all across the state, their families were very, very proud of their going and their records, and the whole series of brothers from a single family because you could join up in German units, right? And that was, I think, very attractive to them, localized kind of recruitment and volunteerism. And I think after working in the prairies and the migrations, this volunteerism kind of spirit really, and against a cause that they could understand, or the two causes, not just the separation of the United States into two different countries, but also the slavery issue, which they really did not agree with.
So unlike New York, there were no organized protests.
No, there were parades here in Iowa. 5 Points, New York. I don't know if there's a 5 Points like that anywhere else in the world in the same way that happened out there. Those nativists were a different kind of nativist. They were a bigoted group of people, and whereas that same kind of nativism must have been here a little bit, but it was so more egalitarian here. People came at the same time. They had neighbors of all different countries and languages and types, and I think it was more of a group effort than anything else.
All right. Thank you so much, and thank you to Glenn and Marlin.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're watching City Channel 4. On TV, online, on demand, on Facebook, and now on the go on your mobile device.